Hi everyone, The Conversation with Nadine Matheson is currently on a little summer break, but don't worry, I'll be back with brand new episodes in September. But in the meantime, I'll be sharing some fan favourite episodes from season 3, along with a few special conversations from Page 1, the Writers Podcast, that I think you'll really enjoy. Thank you so much for all your support throughout season 3. It's been amazing to see the podcast grow, and I'm truly grateful to everyone who's listened, shared and supported us, especially those of you who've bought me a cup of coffee on Ko-fi. It really does make a difference. Now, as always, sit back, we'll go for a walk and enjoy this summer break conversation.
Hi, it's Marco here. Just before we get started with this episode, I wanted to let you know that this episode is available on our YouTube channel as a video podcast as well, so you can see not only myself and Tariq, but this week's brilliant guest. So head on over there. We've put a link in the podcast description and you can watch this episode as well as listen to it. So why not do that and give us a follow while you're there? That would be great. But now we'll get straight into the episode. Hello and welcome to episode 200 of Page 1, the Writers Podcast. I'm Marco.
I'm Tariq.
And thanks for joining us on the podcast where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, find out how they got into the industry and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. And we have obviously reached a huge milestone, a milestone that we never thought we would reach, Tariq.
200 episodes. I genuinely, we started recording these a lot of time in your kitchen.
Yeah,
with various
true.
Guests.
Yeah.
200 episodes. No, it's an amazing achievement. I'm very proud to have gotten this far.
Yeah, no, we've spoken to some authors that we would never have thought we would be able to speak to. Authors that I personally admire, people like Scott Lynch, Joe Abercrombie, Ian Rankin, Joanne Harris. There's a whole list of authors and screenwriters as well. We've spoken to, Hollywood film directors. You spoke to, you love Wrath of Khan, and you spoke to...
That was a dream moment.
Exactly.
Yeah, things like that, where it's people whose books and games and comics we've enjoyed. To get a chance to sit down and chat with them for an hour and a half has been, it's been absolutely fantastic. And so if this is the last episode, then that's fine, because we've had a good time.
Yeah, well, let's hope it's not the last episode.
Also, I quit.
Yeah, exactly. Let's hope it's not the last episode. It is, in fact. We've got a great episode for you today, which we'll tell you about in a moment. But before we do that, I did just want to tell people, regular listeners will have had a special short bonus episode last Friday, but I just wanted to remind people that as part of trying to grow this podcast, make it better, give more content to people of the sort that they're wanting, we have set up a Patreon as well. Now, for those of you that don't know what that is, it's just a website where you can go and you can support the pod. You can join for free and join our Discord, where we're hoping to build a community to talk online about writing, about the podcast, etc. But also there are different sort of paid tiers where you get different benefits if you join, including things like early access to podcast episodes, access to the video of audio-only episodes, free books, free notebooks, things like that. So we'll put a link in the podcast description. We'll talk a bit more about the Patreon at the end of the podcast, but please do check that out. But episode 200, we needed a massive guest. And we not only got one massive guest, we got two.
We are chatting with the fantastic Lee and Andrew Child, the Child brothers. Probably not how they are ever referred to, but Lee Child, of course, is the superstar creator of Jack Reacher, which is just an absolute juggernaut of a franchise. Yeah, 20 odd books. Two films, TV show. It's a huge phenomenon. So we chat to him. He, as many will know, has stepped back recently from writing the Jack Reacher books, and his brother Andrew Child, who's a writer himself, he had 8 or 9 books out before he came onto the Reacher train. He's now taken over, and so in the last 4 or 5 we've written with the two of them, and now Andrew Child's solo writing the Reacher series. So it's a really fascinating chat. I mean, Lee Child's an absolute legend, and the interplay between him and his brother, and this kind of handover of a character between siblings is a really unusual setup, but it's really interesting.
Definitely, and really interesting about hearing about how he came up with the character of Reacher, and as we'll hear, it was more. He had a list of things he didn't want Reacher to be like.
Very clinical decisions. He made about Reacher,
absolutely, and we talk about that side. We talk about, he's not afraid to talk about the commercial side of writing and, writing to try and sell books, which, sometimes authors don't like to talk about that side of things, but Lee and Andrew were both very happy to do that. So it's a great episode. So we will get straight into it after a quick advert for our writer's notebook, of course, and then we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest.
But for now, on with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realise it's not just a story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page one.
Did you always want to be a writer? Did both of you always have that writing bug? Lee, do you want to go first?
The flippant answer to that is I never wanted to be a writer. No, I mean, I was a huge reader. I mean, literally immense reader. Read a book a day probably my whole life. But until I was around 35, I was completely incurious about how a book came into existence. I had no real concept of an author or a publisher. It was just a book was right there. What I really wanted to be was be in the Beatles. I was just intoxicated by that proposition that you could do something that gave people such intense joy, and they gave you back such intense love and approval. I loved that entertainment transaction, and I wanted to be part of that, but writing was not necessarily the way in that I foresaw, and it was not the way in that I took. Like Andrew, we came to it from different routes, but started out with the theater, then I went into television. It was always about entertaining an audience. I lost the job in television, so it was a very late epiphany for me. I thought, what next? What can I do now? Mm-hmm. And it just fell into place. I've been reading all my life. I knew books. I loved books. I thrilled to books. I loved getting them. I loved starting them. They just were a huge thing in my life. So I thought, well, try writing one. And so I did. And then what happened.
Yeah, which is, some career. What about you, Andrew? You went into theatre first, is that right?
I did. And, I think I love that you asked this question because you seem to have writers seem to fall into two camps, don't they? You've got the ones who never really expected it and kind of fell into it by accident, and you've got the ones who always from being a little kid knew they wanted to do it, and I love hearing about people who have the little novels that they wrote and they made covers out of cereal packets and all of that. I love that. Unfortunately, that just wasn't me. Looking back, what I realized is that the thing I was always obsessed with was telling stories. As a little kid, I always used to have to tell a story. I realized I was looking around, everything that was happening around me, I was just mining it for little nuggets that could be used in stories. And, I went through school, went to university to do English literature. And, one of my, Lee will confirm, one of my things is that it doesn't matter what good advice people give me. If I've made up my mind to do something, I do it regardless. So everybody at the school was telling me, don't do English literature. You're not very good at it. You won't like it. But I didn't listen. So I did English literature and it was awful. I absolutely because at school, it was brilliant because the teachers were fabulous. They would introduce you to these amazing books and poems and plays. You could read them. You'd come to class and then you would argue about what you thought the play was about or the book was about. And they encouraged you that you could have it doesn't matter how outlandish and bizarre your theory was, as long as you could justify it. And I thought university would be the same, only bigger and better. But it turned out it was the opposite, because these teachers weren't, encouraging, nurturing teachers. These were people who had these international reputations, and they felt that if you disagreed with them, it wasn't just really cool because you could have an argument about it. They thought that you were, a cheeky, insubordinate, rude. And so the people that did well were the ones that saw what the teachers had already said about whatever the book was and then just regurgitated it. They all got firsts. Anybody that actually had an original thought was in trouble, to the point that I actually got thrown out of the class, one of the classes at one point, for disagreeing with the professor. He said to me, I am the world's leading authority on this subject, and I am telling you this is how it is. And he said, either you apologize or you can leave. So, of course, I left. And, so it was a miserable experience. So I switched to, back in those days, it was very hard to change what you were studying. And the only way to make a dramatic change was to drop out and then come back the next year. And that would have caused problems. So I switched to English and drama, loved the drama side of it. We were just doing plays constantly. Part of the course in the university theatre, we were lucky that the theatre was really good there. We had so much fun doing that. But at the end of the time, you know what it's like when you do something because there's an exam at the end? You can only do the parts that are required for the exam, even though you're saying, there's all this other stuff that's really interesting. That doesn't matter. You've just got to pass the exam. So 6 of us said at the end of it, well, why don't we set up our own theatre company? Before we get bogged down with the mortgages and the houses and all of that, let's just, scratch all these itches that we haven't had a chance to do. So we did that. We had a really, really great time. We achieved pretty much everything we set out to achieve. It took longer than we thought. It took maybe 2 years instead of 1 year. And at the end, we were all broke. So I needed a job. So, this was, again, back before the internet, right? This was when you had to buy the Sunday Times and look in there as a special supplement with all the jobs in it. Yeah. So I was super scientific in my approach. What I did was I cut out all the adverts. I then organized them by starting salary, applied for the highest one, and by some miracle, it was with British Telecom. And, by then you're kind of bogged down, aren't you? You get sucked into the machine. And I thought it would be a temporary thing until I, paid off my overdraft. But I wound up there for 15 years. And during that time, couldn't go to the theatre as much because I was always on the road. So I read more. Realized just by chance it was always crime fiction, spy fiction, that kind of stuff that I was reading. And then one day, the crux of it was I started reading this book that was, it starts off as the perfect book. You cannot put it down. You will stay on the bus past your stop. You will not get off the train. You will stay up all night because you have to find out what happened. But the beginning, brilliant as it was, the end was the opposite. Absolutely dreadful. So disappointing. And I remember there was this moment when I was thinking, well, why did the author do that? He set up all of these potential outcomes, all of these amazing characters he could have played with, all of these subplots he could have. And once you start thinking that, you get to that point where you think, well, could I do it? And then, there are somebody said to me once, the two saddest words in the English language are what if. And I didn't want to get to the end of an okay career and look back and say, yeah, it was okay, but what if I'd tried? Yeah. And, by this point, Lee had already tried. So I thought, well, if one of us can do it, maybe two of us can.
Yeah, I was going to say, was there a bit of, I guess, inspiration or perhaps rivalry there when you saw him having the success? You thought, I'll give that a go.
Well, not really rivalry. It was useful to have someone who could explain the process because, let's face it, publishing isn't the most logical industry, is it? It doesn't do things in the way that you might expect if you've worked anywhere else. So it's useful to have somebody to say, all right, this is step one, this is step two, this is step three. That was very useful. Beyond that, once I actually got published, it kind of worked the opposite way because then you had a lot of people, you bump into them at conferences and stuff, and you'd hear people mumbling and saying, well, if your brother's lead child, how hard, So, it cut both ways. Lots of things helped, few things didn't.
And Lee, you mentioned there that you started writing your Jack Reacher novels when you lost your job in television, and I think I'd read that you began writing each book on the anniversary of the day you started the first one after you lost your job. And I wondered, is that rhythm quite important to you, that kind of sense of organization and structure?
Yeah, I think it's essential because, the difficult thing to communicate about being a writer is that you've got to believe two things, but you've got to believe them each 100%. You don't believe it 50-50 and put half your attention on one and half your attention on the other. You got to believe them both wholeheartedly and give all your attention to both halves. And one half is that, yes, of course, writing is a creative art. It is a joy. It is part of a long intellectual tradition. It's all of those good things, the arts and academic stuff. Absolutely, that's what writing is. But it's also a job. And you've got to make a living. And to do that, you've got to produce the product. It's that simple. And when I was starting out, and I think still now, really, the ideal spacing is a book a year so that it's liable from the reader's point of view. The reader has not forgotten who you are, and a year has built up a lot of anticipation for the next title. So one a year is great. So if you're going to publish one a year, obviously you've got to write one a year. And that is actually a commitment. That is your work. And so it wasn't a sentimental thing to always start on the anniversary of starting the first one. It was a purely practical thing. I'd got one done, now I got to get the next one done, and then one every year in the future. So starting on the same date made perfect organizational sense. Not that I'm an organized person at all, but I do have this clear notion that if you're going to publish once a year, you got to write once a year. So you do need some shape to the year.
And when you're setting out to write a story, are you, has your process changed, and are you someone that will plan it out before you then start getting the words on the page?
No, I went into writing with no knowledge or experience of actually writing, but a lot of what you could call entertainment business experience. I'd worked for commercial television for 18 years. And you very quickly learn that it's not possible to plan a success. You cannot have some high-level meeting where you sit around and say, okay, we need this monster drama hit, so we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this other thing, and it will be a success. You cannot do that. All success is fundamentally accidental, unanticipated. And that's the glory of it. That's what's so wonderful about show business in general, that you don't know anything. Everything is a happy accident or a tragic accident. If you've got something you really believe in, maybe it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Maybe it dies a death. You've got something that is you regard as not much of anything, and it becomes a monster hit. You just do not know. So I was faced with a situation that for me was really important. I was out of work. I was broke. I had a limited number of months living money. I was 7 months into the future, I was going to default on my mortgage, stuff like that. So it had to be done. And so I was urgent about it, but I was also very aware, don't plan, don't outline, don't preconceive anything. It has to be organic. It has to be just spontaneous. So never with any book, any of my books, have I ever had an outline. I've never had a plan. I've never been able to see very far at all. I literally just, every August, I would find, oh, I've got no ideas. I'm washed up. It's all over. I've been found out. This is the end. Every August. And then toward the end of August, I start to have the glimmer of an idea for an opening scene. And by the end of August, it would be pretty firmed up. Maybe I'd even have a great opening line or two. And I would, on the 1st of September, just write them down and then think, okay, that's a great first line. Now, what would be a great second line? And literally it goes on like that. 11,000 lines, I think, is about the average in my books. And it went on and on, just 11,000 separate decisions about what next. Wow. And I think that does make it fluent and spontaneous and as if it's really happening in front of the reader. You ask 10 writers how they do it, you get 47 different answers because everybody's so different. But I imagine, I look at some of my friends who do a year's research and then they do 6 months writing a long 300-page outline and then they write the book. I could not do that because, like Andrew said, it's about the story for me. And the medium is irrelevant. It's about the story. I want to get the story to the reader or the consumer of the story. And we have this very well set up thing where it's books and they read, and that's great. But it's about getting the story to the reader. And so I'm perfectly happy just to see what comes out. I wanted to feel as if I was reading it rather than writing it. And that has informed everything that I do. Think about the reader. Think about me as a reader, not me as a writer. And the very early indication that this could work for me was very early in the process of the first book. I mean, literally, I'd done 2 or 3 scenes and I was ready to do the 4th scene. And then my wife reminded me that, no, tomorrow we got to go and do this other thing. I can't remember what it was. I seem to remember it was hauling giant bags of dog food home from the, which I had to do because I'm the muscle in the family. And so she said that, and I remember feeling that jolt of disappointment, exactly the same as you feel when you've got to put down a great book to go and do something else. You know, it's a unique form of disappointment and irritation and annoyance. You want to stay in that world, want to find out what happens next. And I felt exactly the same thing as a writer. It wasn't that I had this great scene that I was ready to write down. I just wanted to see what would happen next as I sat there and made it up. And to be prevented from doing that gave me that irritation. And then I thought, that's actually pretty good. I'm feeling the same as a writer as I would feel as a reader.
Yeah. And Andrew, your first novel, Even, came out in 2008. And what's your process like? And has your process changed from then till now? Is it similar? Do you just kind of jump in both feet first and see what happens?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think it has changed a bit over the years. It's sort of, in a way, it's gone full circle because with Even, I started exactly as Lee described. I had this picture of a guy walking in New York because at that point in time, I was kind of obsessed with getting somehow to be able to move to New York. So I had this idea of somebody walking along in New York, maybe in the seedy side of the city, cutting through an alleyway and finding a dead body. That was just the visual image that I had. That was the starting point, and I just went from there. Exactly as he's described. Well, what happens next? What happens next? And so I did that. With the books, and that's it only ran for 3 books. I'd been happier if it had run longer, but for those ones, that's what I did. Then a change of direction. I moved to a different publisher. They wanted me to do something else, so I did a standalone. And then after that, I did a series about a detective in Birmingham, Alabama, which was, partly, a little, fun for me because, we're from Birmingham, England. So I wanted to, I thought it'd be funny to, to switch to the other Birmingham. And so with those books, what I wanted to do, the structure of them to work in a very specific way. In each one of them, I wanted there to be 3 storylines, which intertwined and then came to a conclusion at the end. And I wanted it to be that you never had consecutive chapters that dealt with the same storyline. Yeah. So I found myself working a lot more ahead of time, because I'm thinking, rather than just saying, well, what happens next? Well, what if it had been the wrong storyline where I thought of what happened next? I wanted to make sure that the way that they intertwined was working the way that I needed it to. So that series, I did plan a bit more. And I carried some of that over into the books that I wrote after that. But what I discovered with Reacher, it was, quite a daunting prospect to take over this mantle. And I wanted to make sure that I did a good job with it. And so I thought, normally in life, what they say to you is that the more you prepare, the better the outcome is going to be. So I had a sense, well, maybe I should prepare. Maybe I should really try to think ahead. And what I discovered was every time I did that, it was a waste of time, because, you would finish a scene, you'd think, I'm ahead of the game here because I've planned the next one. And you know what? You realize, no, Reacher wouldn't have do that, or the villain wouldn't do that, or, there's something better that you hadn't thought of previously. So what I realized is, particularly for the Reacher books, it doesn't work to plan them. And I think there's a way in which, Lee was talking about how it's kind of exciting for the reader because it's really like it's happening. The Reacher books, they have quite a kind of confident style to them. And I think that if you are walking, say you're walking on a tightrope and there's no safety net, you have to be confident that you're going to reach the other side. You can't be tiptoeing along thinking, well, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter if I fall off because there's a safety net. Well, if there isn't a safety net, you have to make damn sure that you don't fall off and you get to the other side. Yeah. And I think that kind of is reflected in the tone and the mood of the writing.
Yeah. And let's talk Jack Reacher then. I mean, Lee, obviously he is an iconic figure now, but how much of him did you know when you began writing it? Did you have just a picture of this guy, or where did it start?
Well, I had, as I said, I wasn't going to take any prior decisions and map out a laundry list of what I needed to do. I did sort of map out a slight anti-laundry list, in as much as, again, being... it was necessary that this worked. This was not like something I vaguely wanted to do. This had to work. And so when you're going into a competitive marketplace, it seemed to me, don't go head to head with people that are already doing something really well. Why do that? And I looked around and, as I said, been a big reader all my life. And there were very few strands or trends that I was unaware of, and very few new authors. I haunted bookstores. I wanted the new authors. And there were a couple that had just started out before me that were doing excellent stuff. And one in particular that I remember mentally referring to was Michael Connelly, who was starting out with the Bosch series. And previously in television, fundamentally, my talent was to know what the audience would like, to know how the audience would react. And I read Connelly's first couple, and I could see this guy's going to be a major success. People are going to love this. It is going to be a significant series. So I thought, well, don't do anything that he's doing, because why do that? Why go head to head with somebody you've already identified as really good? Why not find a different path? And on top of that, I was also interested in alienation and solitude. So it was pretty obvious to me that if you've got Harry Bosch is a cop with underlings, with superiors, with a fixed workplace, with fixed duties, and he's got a house and he's got a family and he's got neighbors and all that kind of thing. Everybody else was fundamentally doing the soap opera. And I have nothing bad to say about soap operas. It's an incredibly powerful narrative engine that we can see all around us. You know, I worked for the company that made Coronation Street, which started in 1961, and it's still going. And soap opera audiences are smart and sophisticated. They can remember storylines from 4 weeks ago that they then join up to the future. Soap operas are great, but why compete head-to-head with people that were doing them so well? Mm-hmm. So I decided literally everything would be opposite. Hieronymus Bosch was like a fancy name, so I was going to find the plainest name. He had a job. My guy would have no job. He had a house. My guy would have no house. It was a kind of reaction against what else was happening that very conveniently enabled me to explore the alienation of a person that just wanders around, loving solitude, feeling lonely, that the fundamental conflicts that you get in that life. So so there was that amount of preconception, I suppose. Mm-hmm. After that, it was a question of just metaphorically closing my eyes and writing and seeing what came out. And Reacher is what came out. And then, of course, retrospectively, you can start figuring it out when you're secure in the character and the method. Some books down the track, you can start figuring out, why is this guy working? And he's working because he was not an invention. He is the classic loner, the mysterious stranger, the knight errant that has shown up at practically every stage of our storytelling history, going back not just hundreds of years, but really thousands of years. This character has always been around. And so you ask yourself the basic question, why is he still around? Why has this character repeated in different versions for thousands of years? And the only answer can be because people crave that character. They either want to be that character or they want that character's help in their lives. And so they return to it over and over again. So retrospectively, I could see why it was working, but it was super important at the time to just do it instinctively.
I mean, I definitely felt like, to me, reading the books like this, it was a kind of throwback to kind of stories you'd see in the 70s and 80s, those kind of hard-boiled, violent, lone man coming to town to solve a problem. And I wondered, what kind of stuff did you guys read? You know, was that kind of stuff that you guys enjoyed watching and reading, those kind of stories?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a large age gap between me and Andrew, but one fascinating thing and that has made the handover possible is that we're on exactly the same wavelength with books. Okay. It's a miracle, really, if anybody has ever read the same book, because there are so many books around that what are the odds of people having read the same book? And certainly Andrew's read books that I haven't and vice versa, but the core of our reading has been similar. And he's the kind of guy I can say, you know, we talk about some old title, let's say an Alistair MacLean, and I can say, I wasn't quite sure about that, and I know that he knows what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. So I started out with all the usual things. I'm not one of those pretentious writers who says, yeah, I was reading Dostoevsky when I was 7. I was reading Enid Blyton when I was 7, and Biggles, and by this sort of 9 or 10, I was reading Alistair MacLean, and absolutely that mainstream track. I would say probably of my first influences, Alistair MacLean would be the first big influence I had. He was everywhere during my childhood. You know, my dad had a couple of old paperbacks on the shelf. There was a full set at the library. Everybody's dad had read one or two. He was a huge figure, and he really was my first influence.
And strangely enough, he was mine as well, but for a completely different reason. Because you know, by the time I was of an age to be thinking about reading that kind of thing, he wasn't as prevalent anymore because a few years had passed and the spotlight had shifted to newer authors. But I had this bizarre experience at school. School in the 1970s. The school I went to had this idea that if the teachers marked the kids' work, that was in some way elitist. and very bad, because if you didn't get a very good mark, you might be unhappy, and that couldn't be allowed. So they set work for you to do, but they wouldn't mark it. And I felt that this was like a fundamental betrayal. I felt that if I'm going to make the effort to do the work, the teacher can make the effort to mark the work. I don't see why I should be the one doing everything. And the teacher literally sat at his desk all day reading a newspaper. He would set us projects to do, which he wouldn't mark. So I did the first one. He didn't mark it, and I thought, no more of that. So I would bring books to school and just read under the desk. And normally, he would get up every half hour or something and wander around the classroom to see who wasn't working. And normally, you had a pretty decent sixth sense. I could pick up on when he was coming, so pretend to be doing something. But one day I was reading Watership Down. Do you remember that book? With the rabbits.
Yeah.
And
Brutally
it just
sad.
Yeah, it just completely grabbed me to the point that I didn't notice that he was creeping up on me. So he caught me, he grabbed the book, and he looked at it, and he was so disdainful. First of all, he said that it was a book for babies. It wasn't a book that, I think I was 10 or something. You shouldn't be reading this book. Then he came up with this bizarre statement. He said, "So you think you're a good reader, do you? Well, he says, I tell you, you're not a good reader. You're not a good reader unless you can pick up any book off any shelf and read it without thinking." So the first of all, I'm thinking, well, read without thinking, isn't that kind of like but then, of course, it sounded like a challenge, and nothing has got me into more trouble over the years than challenges. I just simply cannot walk away from them. So I got home that afternoon, went to our father's bookshelf, and he said, any books. I closed my eyes, pulled one off the shelf, and it was Ice Station Zebra by Alistair MacLean. And so I thought, at this point, there's like a little bit of doubt is creeping in, because I'm like, well, oh my God, what if he was right? What if I can't read this book? What if it's too hard? So I start reading it, and it just, I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but it's first person. The narrator is trying to get a ride on an American nuclear submarine that's docked at Holy Loch in Scotland. And he talks his way onto the submarine, and you're completely convinced by his explanation, as is the captain of the submarine, else he wouldn't have got on. But at the end of the chapter, he reveals that he's completely lying. He made the whole thing up. And I'm 10 years old. I had no idea that, because you're taught that you mustn't lie, and that, books are a reliable source of information. So, when you got to this point where you thought, wait a minute, the guy's lying and he's doing it in a book, it just blew my mind. So, that was, looking back, this teacher, who was, evidently just, didn't want to be involved in any teaching. He actually, in a way, was one of the biggest influences in getting to the point now where my whole life revolves around books, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, indeed. And Lee, just going back to the, what you were saying about how you came to Reacher and the sort of, not the list about him, but the anti-list, which definitely had, you said this had to work. So you had an eye on the commercial side of things, which, in a way is refreshing to hear from, a lot of aspiring authors and stuff will say they do it for the love of writing and, I just want to write my story and stuff. But there is a commercial side to this if you want to be a published author as well, and you need to have that thought in your mind. And I think I'm right in saying that you've always had that at the forefront. I think you gave Reacher a French parent to try and appeal more to French readers and things like that. I mean, how important is that, do you think, to making a living out of writing, I guess?
The French mother thing probably went nowhere, because I had heard, I was entering the whole thing with very patchy, partial misinformation. And I'd heard that the French are notoriously closed to external imports for fiction. So I thought, well, I'll give him a French mother, because I wanted to emphasize his rootlessness, his international background. So I thought a foreign mother made perfect sense. And I thought, oh, no, I'll make a French so that at least they'll buy them in France. And actually, that was the hugest failure of my entire career. I sell for shit in France.
Oh, really?
I've had long explanations from French publishers about it, how it's very genre categorized in France. The policier which would be the employed detective type of books, and they love westerns and they love this and that, but somehow Risha falls between all the cracks. But I can't get arrested in France, so that particular strategy did not work at all. But in general, yeah, there's nothing to be ashamed about. It's a commercial thing. It's about achieving a readership, and the size of your readership is up to you. You know, there are plenty of authors who, especially literary types, who are, they've got a university job probably, and if they sell 5,000 or 6,000 copies of a novel, that's great for them, and they're satisfied and they're happy. But if you're trying to make a living, the problem is, I remember talking to my agent very early on when I first got an agent, and at a very introductory conversation, he said, "How much do you need? How much do you want?" And I told him the salary in my old job that I'd just lost, and and I said, "I need to replace this, basically." And he said, "I can't do that," which was initially not very encouraging.
Yeah.
He said, "You can't aim for that. You'll either get less or you'll get more. There is no middle." And in that first attempt, so I said, "Well, I'll have more then. Thanks." And so the ambition was there from the agent too, but it's not just about making a living and the money. It's about proving the concept. It's about actually doing what you do. That old saying, "If a tree falls in the forest," or my version of that is, if a man speaks in a forest and his wife is not there to hear him, is he still wrong? So there's no point in writing a book or putting on a show or a play if nobody's going to watch it. And it used to really annoy me back in the 70s, where there was a huge burst of experimental theater that I was sometimes participating in, and nobody would come. And the people would take that as a badge of honor. We're so advanced. We're so out there. We're so ahead of the curve. But to me, that was bullshit. If you put on a show and nobody watches it, you haven't really put on a show. And it's the same thing with a story. If you tell a story and nobody listens, then you haven't really told a story. So the audience is not just important commercially, it's important as half of the transaction.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's often a sense of if you even dare to mention the fact that you need to make a living, and this is your job. The idea that anything involving money being attached to it is tawdry and unacceptable. But I think there's another aspect to it, which is that if you are doing it as a hobby, that is completely fine. But if you're doing it for a living, if it is your job, there is a satisfaction, a personal satisfaction that comes from knowing that you have done that job as well as you're capable of doing it. And, that is tied into, if does the product sell? Well, it'll only sell if it's a good product. How do you get a good product? Well, you work your ass off to make it as good as you possibly can make it. And I think, obviously, when a book comes out, you want it to be commercially successful, but you also need, before any of that, to be able to look back and say, based on the amount of time I had and the amount of talent I have, I could not have done better. People might hate the book, it might not sell, it might get awful reviews, but I did the best I could do. That's for me. When that final, the final word is written and the email goes off to the editor, I have to be able to say to myself, despite what anyone else might think of it, I know that I did the best that I could do. Because and I think that ties into the fact that it is a job, and doing the job well leads hopefully to some form of success.
Yeah, and one question that I did want to ask actually is that I heard a story that may be apocryphal, Lee, so you can correct me if I'm wrong here. But someone said, talking about sort of working with editors, and there's that stage obviously of getting the notes back from the editor and stuff like that. And someone said that it told a story about you, which was that, when you first get that list of notes, your immediate reaction as, not you, but just generally, your immediate reaction as an author is to go, nah, it's all wrong. It was right. And then a day later, you sort of go, well, maybe that first one's right. And then a few days later, well, maybe this one, and eventually you start to accept them? I mean, was that a true story, or?
Yeah, it was absolutely. I remember, you would get those notes, and in the early days, they would come in by fax or something like that. So it was a literal letter. And I would read it, and I would be incandescent with rage for a good 24 hours. And then, as you say, then I think, well, maybe that point, but the rest of it's rubbish.
Yeah.
And then the next day, well, that point. But it is editing for me in the early days was like that, and I would make those. I would adjust things based on what I thought was a good point, and I always would do that. But you then fall into a pattern where when you're doing a book year after year, and you get to know your editor, you get to know their habits and their process. And one of them, the UK editor, was a little more squeamish than she really should have been for a Reacher book. And so she would panic about some of the really bad violence. So I went through a 2 or 3 book phase where I would put in a completely superfluous scene for her to object to so I could take it out. So that would keep it, she felt she'd done her work. And then later on, sort of after the middle period, later in the series, I would say to the editors, because one thing really annoyed me, because, Reacher by this point was a big bestseller, and therefore they're very reverential about that book. And so I would send in the new manuscript to the American editor, who would read it instantly, and I would get something back within probably 4 hours saying, "This is fantastic, love it." And I would reply and say, "Yeah, okay, what changes do you want?" And she would say, "Oh, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. Just leave it. It's brilliant." And that would go on for like 3 weeks. And then eventually she would say, "Well, there is this thing." And I resented that because it had wasted 3 weeks. We could have fixed it already. So that was a bump in the road. So then I sort of tried to focus their minds a little bit. I definitely never was or never wanted to be a big bossy author where the publishers are scared of you. I absolutely hated that concept because I'd seen it happen with other authors, and it's just not a good way to behave. So I was always prepared to be super cooperative and humble about it, but I needed efficiency. So I eventually introduced a rule where I said, you can make 3 points and I will look at one of them. And that kind of focused the editor's attention down to what was essential.
Right, okay. What about you, Andrew? How do you deal with notes as well?
Yeah, I mean, very similar. I mean, yeah, the first 24 hours, I mean, Tasha, she goes into hiding, I think, when she knows the editorial editor is coming because, yeah, absolute, craziness to start off with. But, I've often found it, I think it's an interesting, it's super useful to have, if you're writing a book where you are intending certain things to be a surprise, they're obviously not a surprise to you because you know what happens and you put it there in the first place. So it's very useful to have somebody who can say, that was too obscure, it jumped out of nowhere, you need to signal it a bit more, or no, it was too obvious that it was coming. So that, it's confirmation as to whether the surprises and the twists and things, I think, are very useful. And also you want the book to be accessible to as many people as possible. So if there's something that makes total sense to you but doesn't necessarily make sense to anybody else, you need to know about that as soon as possible. But I have, over the years, I've had weird experiences where I've had certain books where I've been thinking, no, this book is the way I want it to be, and the editors have wanted changes. And then I've had other ones where I'm like, I can tell there's something wrong with this. I know it's not working the way I need it to work yet. And the editors are like, no, it's totally fine. You don't need to change it. I'm like, but I do. It's not right yet. So, it is a funny process.
And I wanted to ask you guys about your process because, your recent collaborative process, because Andrew, as everyone will be aware, you've now joined the kind of Reacher train in the last few years. Lee's stepping down after writing, I think, 24 novels plus all the short stories, and you're coming in to take over, which is a really kind of unusual setup, like a brother passing the torch to another one. And I kind of wondered, how did that come about? And also, what was it like? Because you guys wrote a few novels together as a pair. What was that like working as a pair? You know, what was the process there? Was it the same, or was it fun?
It was a short conversation about the process, because there really isn't a process. You know, it's just about what would Reacher do with whatever is set up for him on the page. And so for the first collaboration, we did have a sort of page, a blank page discussion, essentially. I had one thing on my mind in particular, which was that Reacher was grotesquely behind the curve in terms of technology. And personally, I think it's good to have your main character somewhat behind the curve, because then each reader does not feel inadequate in comparison. They might even feel a little superior, and that's a good thing too. But Reacher had fallen decades behind, to the point where it was no longer a kind of cute aspect of his character. It was more like a disability. So that was my point to Andrew. I said, look, there's one thing we have to do, which is drag him a little bit into the future, at least with technology. And that's all that I said. And Andrew said in turn, well, what I want to do, because here's the thing, you know, this was not me sitting down and saying to Andrew, look, there's this guy called Reacher, and this is what he does. It wasn't like that, because Andrew had been involved since day zero, effectively. As I said, we read the same stuff, and Andrew is the only thriller reader whose judgment I would trust. And so when I wrote that first book, when it was still in manuscript, in pencil, basically, I wanted Andrew to read it so that he could tell me, you know, he could say, yeah, this is okay. Or he could say, you know what, you better get that warehouse job that you were talking about last week. So I needed that. So Andrew's been on board since before the beginning. So his point when we had this discussion was, I want to go back to those earlier books where Reacher actually talks more, where he is capable of sustaining an entire paragraph and being funny and sarcastic, and using words as weapons just as much as his body. And I had not really realized, but I had, over the span of 24 books, I had somehow reduced Reacher's dialogue to the point where it was super pithy. If I could do 3 words instead of 4, I would do that. Anything that ran onto a second line was practically like a filibuster for Reacher. And so Andrew's point was, no, it was fun. When Reacher made fun of people where he talked, where he did this and that, let's go back to that too. So we did. That was the fundamental setup, but then it was the usual chaos. Just, you know, no idea what the story was going to be about, and no idea how we were going to do it.
But how did you guys actually do the process in terms of writing it? Did you both sit in the same room together? Did you write chapters and swap them, pass them back and forth? What was the setup?
Well, you know, that was I sort of both of the above because of the timing. Because when we started writing, the first one we did together was The Sentinel, leading on from that conversation that Lee described. And so we start that on 1st of September 2019, because, you know, that's the right day. Yeah. And we work up until Christmas. And in Wyoming, we have houses 3 miles apart. So we would come over to my house. And my office was like a walkout basement, so you could just come straight in. And then really, it felt like a very natural thing, because for 25 years, we had sat around messing about, saying, what would Reacher do about this? What would Reacher think about that? Just for fun. You know, we were always glad there were no psychiatrists in the area, because we were talking about him like an invisible extra brother or something. And so we'd done this all for a quarter of a century. And the difference was now I just had to write it down as opposed to just do it for fun. So we were able to do it in person in the same room. But then Christmas came along, we went off and did different things. And by the time we were ready to get back together and continue, push through to the end of the book, of course, the pandemic had struck, and we'd both been traveling, we'd been in different places, and we were trying to be conscientious about it. So we had to start working remotely. And what we found, certainly my perspective on it was much less fun because, doing a job that's really fun with your brother, you can't argue with that. So not being together in the same room was not as enjoyable. But I think in terms of the process, it was much more realistic and much more efficient. Because when we would get together in my office, and say you'd written something the night before, you just can't help it. The other person walks in and you say, right, this is what I've done. This is how it leads on from the previous bit. This is why I think it's important. This is what it sets us up for the next scene. Can't help but do that. And once you've done it, the other person can't unhear it. Mm-hmm. So when they're reading those words, they're doing it based on what they've just heard. And obviously a reader, when they buy the book or get it from the library, they don't have you sitting on their shoulder whispering in their ear. And so the words aren't standing on their own, they're being supported by their explanation. And so once we got to just emailing it back and forth, we were in the same boat as the reader was. All you had was the words on the page, and either those words were good enough or they weren't. And it was much quicker and easier for us to determine, no, this isn't working, it has to be changed, or yes, it's fine, move on. So the process began the one way, and then with the intervention of the pandemic, it changed. And then, towards certainly maybe the second one, certainly the third one, we could have gone back to doing it in person, but we just figured, well, we've hit on or been forced into really a process that is actually effective and efficient. So it makes much more sense to stick with it rather than be self-indulgent and do something just because it's more enjoyable. So we stuck with that same process, and that's what we did for the ones where we were cooperating.
And the latest book is In Too Deep, which I think I'm right in saying is this the first one that you're completely on your own, Andrew, or did Lee have input into this one as well?
Well, we had input in terms of the fun parts. They're saying what's he doing. But yeah, in terms of producing the manuscripts, that was me.
And do you want to tell us a little bit about that one?
Well, what happens in this one, there are many different, Reacher's the same every time, but he's seen in different settings and in different environments. And in fact, the previous one, The Secret, that was a prequel. We'd gone back in time to when he was still in the army. And there has been some books where he's in cities, some books where he's, in smaller places. And, we lately said to start off with is really very much just a sense of what is the feeling like? What do you want this book to feel like? And I wanted it to feel like one of those kind of isolated, almost claustrophobic ones where he's stuck in the middle of nowhere without, a huge amount of people around him. So what happens in this book is it opens with Reacher waking up. He's been knocked unconscious. He wakes up and he finds himself strapped to a table in a darkened room. No idea how he got there. No idea what happened. And it turns out that he'd been hitchhiking in a car, and the car had an accident. And the driver of the car was dead. And the people who this guy worked with thought that Reacher was in some way responsible for this, and so had basically brought him back to their base in order to be able to interrogate him and questioning him. And of course, if you're the kind of person who manacles Reacher to a table, fair to say that your future is not going to be very bright. So we had a lot of fun with, Reacher obviously immediately escapes and then sets about dealing with these guys.
Nice.
Yeah, he's giving me too much credit there. I mean, it was, and it was a bit like the second book we did together, where Andrew sort of preempted the process a little bit by secretly writing the first chapter and just emailing it to me. And his point about all you get is the words on the page. That's all anybody's ever going to see. And so he did that ahead of time, and it was a fantastic first chapter. So yeah, he took control really at that point. And this In Too Deep, I loved the setup of it, because the problem with Reacher is how do you get him involved? Yeah. He's got no official standing anywhere. He's not a detective. He's not federal. He's not nothing. He's just a guy. And so everything you do has to be a coincidence. And the reader, generally speaking, gives you a free pass. He's in the wrong place at the wrong time. But you've got to keep it subtle. And the idea that he hitches a ride, which he does, 300 days a year, he hitches a ride. And that is totally normal. It's just the Reacher universe. But there was a car wreck. The driver screwed up and went off the road. Now, that is brilliant. That is a glancing approach. It is not like some big ponderous setup. That is exactly right for her. And then it unspools from there. And so, we perfected it over 3.5 books, really. We perfected the idea. All it's about is words on the page. And I was always very reluctant to inflate the stakes all the time. That's something that happens with writers. You diffuse a nuclear bomb in the center of Manhattan. Yeah. So what are you going to do in the next book? 2 nuclear bombs in the center of Chicago.
It becomes crazy stupid at the end.
Yeah, it gets stupid. And I always try to restrain that. Just make the villains sometimes banal, sometimes small time, sometimes incredibly local, in order to just have a meaty adventure in which Reacher could save the day. And again, Andrew's instinct is dead on for that. We're not going to see Reacher defusing 3 nuclear bombs in Los Angeles.
Yeah. Okay.
And Lee, are you sad to leave him behind? What's your thoughts on stepping away? Are you quite glad? You excited for the future?
I find that a sort of odd question, because to me, the whole point of writing a character is to give it away. Your number one goal is to give it away to the reader so that the reader owns that character. And that's a serious intellectual point. My first book is how old now? 27 years old. And yet somebody will pick it up today, hopefully, and read it for the very first time. So that story was in my head 27 years ago. Now it is in the reader's head all this time later. And it's the reader's energy that's being consumed. The reader's calories are being burned. It's happening in the reader's brain. And so the reader does own the character. And you really want to get to that threshold where Reacher becomes public property. And within, 6 or 10 books, I got there. Reacher belonged to everybody. People initially would talk to me knowing full well I'm the author of the books, and so they're a little bit respectful or whatever. Later on, it was as if Reacher had just materialized out of thin air and belongs to nothing to do with me whatsoever. I was on vacation once and a woman was reading the book and she recognized me from the author photograph and got into a conversation about it. And she said, "Oh, I'm loving this one. So much better than the last one. That was awful." And she's, talking to me as if I'm just another bystander or reader, fan. And that is what you want. So giving it away first to the movies, then the TV, now to Andrew, is consonant with all of that. It's what I wanted to happen. I wanted the character to stand alone and stand strong. And it's about the character. In fact, that was always my belief. It's about the character. That's all there is. And we toyed with the idea of not having an author name on the books at all, just a Jack Reacher story, as if it had materialized from thin air. Publishers wouldn't go for that. It was too weird for them, and also too hard about alphabetizing the author and all of this, what do you put in that column and so on. So we didn't do it, but that was the fundamental aim, I think. And we got proof of it once. The guy that is the bookkeeper at my agent's place was in an airport queuing up to buy a book, and there was an old lady in front of him with the new Reacher book. And he couldn't resist. He sort of nudged her and say, "I work for the agent that represents that author." And she said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, Lee Child has an agent, and I work for that business." And she said, "No, this is a Jack Reacher book." He said, "No, but Lee Child writes them." And she said, "What? You mean Jack tells him the story and he writes it down?" Now, that is an extreme example, and I don't mean to be patronizing about it at all, but that is exactly what I wanted. That the character is the thing. The character exists, and everything else is an illusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the movie adaptations there. I mean, obviously there was the Tom Cruise adaptation, and then more recently the Amazon version with Alan Richardson. Do you go into these, I suppose, following on from what you were just saying there, do you go into these enjoying it as a viewer almost, rather than being worried about how it will turn out and stuff like that?
Yeah, very much. I mean, I'm always cautious about who I sell it to. That's my one rule. You got to like the people, you got to trust the people, and you got to admire the previous work that they've done. And if they pass those tests, then sure, just give it to them 100%, and then it is their project, because nothing works if you are peering over their shoulder all the time, fussing and fetching about what are they doing with my book.
Yeah.
That never, ever works. So all you got to do is pick your people, make sure they're fans, make sure they love it, and then let them get on with it. And so I had no problem with that either. I mean, I knew that the Tom Cruise thing was going to be controversial. But again, looking at it from an author's point of view, it was 2005 that we did that deal that eventually resulted in the Tom Cruise movies. And 2005, I was only like 8 years into it.
Yeah.
And here was the world's biggest film star offering to spend $150 million promoting my brand around the world. Obviously I was going to say yes to that. And what interested me, actually, the difference between film and TV, the films had massive effects on book sales globally, massive. And the TV has very little. It seems to be a completely different demographic or completely different result in terms of promoting books.
Even though, certainly from the reader reaction, what you read is that people, readers of the book say, oh, the Amazon version, he's much more like Jack Reacher, how I think of him, etc., etc. But it's not having the effect on the book sales, because it's maybe bringing people that already know the character and not
I think,
to as wide an audience.
Time has passed and more people have already known the books. I think it's also a slight result of the very expansive running time you've got in a TV season. It feels much more like the complete story, whereas it's possible to imagine somebody watching the movie with about 90 minutes of content, and they take that to be like a taster. Yeah. And so they think, okay, I'll go and get the full deal. Whereas TV looks like the full deal from the start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Andrew, what's your thoughts going forward? I mean, how far do you have like a kind of end goal in mind in terms of how many books you want to write, or is it a case of just I'll write them as long as the readers are there to read them?
No, you hit the nail on the head. Yeah, I mean, I'm loving it, and I'd love to keep going as long as possible. So as long as readers are enjoying reading them, I'm going to do my best to keep on writing them.
Nice. Excellent. And Lee, I think I'm right in saying that your short story book, which is not Jack Reacher related, is out on Wednesday, as we record this episode anyway. Is that right? And that's are you enjoying exploring non-Reacher stories now?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a book of short stories that some of them are 20 years old. They're the short stories I've done that don't involve Reacher, because that's already been done in a separate volume. To me, short stories were always an odd thing. I was so naive when I went into it. I thought you wrote novels, and then the very first thing that happened, you write a novel, it gets some measure of success or respect. Somebody asks you for a short story. And to me, that felt like, you're a baseball player, you've had a great season, so somebody asks you to start playing basketball. It felt like
it's a different skill. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And so I had this really strange blind spot in my head that, that you don't get any money out of short stories. It's not like somebody's paying you a big advance for it. You either give it away because it's a charity thing or in support of a writers' organization or whatever, or you get a nominal fee, £200 or something like that. So And in my showbiz brain, if you're not getting money, that means nobody's watching it. And so I was under the illusion that I was doing these short stories and they would never be read. So I could do whatever I wanted. And it was fantastically liberating. Not that in any way I ever resented being stuck with Reacher. I loved it. I had a great time. But the chance just to flex your muscles and do something different, be a different person, different time of history, different nationality. You could be a bit of a loser. You could be a weakling. You could just explore anything. And so I enjoyed doing the short stories, but never paid them much mind at all. And then somebody said, why don't we do a collection of them? And I'm like, are you sure? These things? And they really wanted to do it. So yeah, there they are.
Brilliant.
Nice.
And going forward, what are your writing plans going forward?
Mine? I want to be retired. I just, a seminal day in my life was when I was starting primary school and, wrestling with reading, writing, arithmetic, all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, my grandfather was retiring. And I did not know what that word meant at the age of 5. So I said to my mother, what does that mean? And she said, well, it means he's not going to do any work anymore. He's just going to stay home and do what he wants. And there was me, reading. I thought, damn, that sounds pretty good. So in a way, I think it's a very British thing too, that it's 3 phases in your life. You go to school for a bit, you work for a very long time, and then you retire, which is a specific thing. And so I want to enjoy that.
Nice.
So hopefully I won't be doing anything at all. I'll just be like my granddad, being at home, doing whatever he wants.
Sounds good. And Andrew, you've got the Reacher books coming down the line. I mean, would you want to write other things as well, or are you just solely focused on Reacher at the moment?
Well, at the moment, I'm solely focused on Reacher because it's more than a full-time job. I mean, if I could somehow create more hours in the day, I'd like to write more of the books in the series I was doing, before coming on board with Lee. That would be very fun to do. So that's definitely something I've got in the back of my mind, but I haven't figured out the logistics yet of how to actually do that, and also have time to eat and sleep. So maybe one day if I can make it happen, I'd like to do more of the Paul McGrath janitor books as well.
Brilliant. Well, those were the main questions that we had for you both, but we always like to end the podcast very quickly asking the same questions of our guests. The first of which is, what was the last book that you both read? We'll start with Andrew.
Well, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. The last book I read was actually the manuscript, because my wife Tasha Alexander writes historical mysteries, and I just read the manuscript for her book that's coming out next year. So bit of a cheat, maybe, but
it counts.
Nice.
It counts.
Good. Yeah.
What about you, Lee?
I'm in the middle of a book called Living the Beatles Legend by a guy called Kenneth Womack. And it's about Mal Evans, their first and long-time roadie.
Yeah.
Partly because I love the Beatles, but also partly because I love the way that I'm old enough now that serious retrospective histories can happen about periods I remember very well. And I remember what I was doing literally on certain days. And then later on, you find out what else was happening. And I find that somehow fascinating. Like, I remember my 7th birthday. I was at my grandma's in Yorkshire. And the day before my 7th birthday, over in Liverpool, a little guy called Raymond Jones walked into a record store and asked for a record where the backing band was an obscure local group called the Beatles. I remember that happened the day before my 7th birthday. The day after my 7th birthday, while I was still in Yorkshire with my grandma, the Soviet Union tested the biggest hydrogen bomb explosion ever recorded in history. Probably was more powerful than all the munitions ever used in all of history before it. And so you start to piece together, you remember your own life, but you see how everything else fits around it now.
Yeah.
And what about the last film that you both watched? What was that, Andrew?
last film I watched was that movie Ferrari.
Oh, yeah.
The Michael Mann
Adam
movie,
Driver. Yeah, I'm kind of obsessed with the era of motor racing in the late 50s, 60s, early 70s. It's not. I don't find it as interesting now because it's more like computers on wheels. I love that era when it was all about the stories that you read about John Cooper welding two halves of two wrecked cars together and coming up with the first ever car where the engine is behind the driver instead of in front. And Ferrari himself saw that car and said it was ridiculous because he said the ox pulls the cart, it doesn't push the cart. And then when the Cooper cars won all of the races, then all of a sudden the next season, suddenly Ferrari's got his engines in the back. And so, that era where, just an inspired individual, a maverick genius could not only exist, but thrive. There's a story about where John Cooper was racing his own cars. And one day he was in a race in Brighton or somewhere up against Alec Isagonis, who was also driving the car that he'd invented. So you've got Cooper and the guy that invented the Mini competing against each other in the same race. That era where, obviously ridiculously dangerous, people being kicked right and left. And actually, that was one of the fun. Maybe I've got a bad sense of humor or something, but that movie Ferrari, every now and again the car crashes and of course it goes flying off the racetrack and you actually see the little finger of the driver flying along waving his arms and legs before smashing into the ground and being horribly killed. But no, I thought I was hesitant about the movie because there's been 2 or 3 really good motor racing movies in the last years, and I was kind of worried that maybe that seam had been tapped out and that there wouldn't be enough left. But actually, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really good movie.
Great.
Ford v Ferrari, I remember watching fairly recently for the first time, thinking that was incredible. As someone who's not a massive racing fan, that totally sucks me in.
Yeah, well, the guy who the English driver who was central, the character Christian Bale played in real life. That guy was in the same unit in the army as our father was in the Second World War.
Oh, no way!
Right.
Wow, that's nuts. Oh, very cool. Lee, what was the last film you watched?
It's embarrassing because I can't remember the title, but it was the movie that Julia Roberts made for Netflix about the sort of apocalyptic meltdown that was happening. She and her family went to an Airbnb on Long Island and were settling in for a nice little week's vacation. And then everything starts going wrong electronically with the...
I know the one you mean.
Teslas were suddenly commanded to drive out of the dealerships and crash on a road. We went through a phase of watching a lot of Julia Roberts. The previous one I can remember with the title was Notting Hill. We watched it.
Yeah.
Old school,
Is it Leave the World Behind? Is that what it was called? The Netflix?
Yeah, Leave the World Behind.
Yeah.
Someone. So yeah, I enjoyed that. That was a pretty good movie because I just moved house and I'm in this house that it's called a smart house. It has passive house insulation as LEED certification, and it's a smart house. It all runs from a computer in the basement.
Wow.
And that to me is science fiction, and I've had to have people around, and I say, look, I know this is a smart house, but I'm a dumb owner, so it's
lastly, what about the last TV show that you watched or are watching at the moment, Andrew?
So the last TV show I watched was the Blacklist with James Spader.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. I enjoyed that show quite. It's a ridiculous show, but you could watch him read the phone book. He's just incredible.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. You're right. I mean, the premise of it is ridiculous. The setup. Why he wants this particular FBI agent to be the only one he'll deal with. Doesn't take a genius to figure that one out. But it's actually, it's enjoyable, and as you say, mainly because he is just such a charismatic actor.
Brilliant. Yeah.
And Lee, what about you?
Well, I watch a lot of ongoing stuff. I watch The Rookie and 911. a lot of network shows. The last standalone thing I watched was again on Netflix, the Beckham.
Yeah.
Which I know is relatively old now, but I loved that. I thought, what a naked, vulnerable personality he is. And my story about David Beckham is that he once washed my car.
Was this before he was famous? Or?
It was when my daughter went to secondary school. We moved quite a long distance out of Manchester up into almost the Lake District. And she started her secondary school and fell in with a bunch of friends. And obviously, being a concerned father, I wanted her to have this group of friends. And I got this message from them: do I know where Manchester United train? Because they knew I worked in Manchester.
Yeah.
The further away you get from Manchester, the more passionate the United fans are. And so I said, sure, I know where they train, because ITV always had a very strong relationship with the local football club. Before Sky and before the Premier League, very, very integrated. So I said, sure. And it was the Cliff back then. So they said, will you take us down to watch training? So I thought, well, yeah, So we drove down to Manchester and pulled up at the gate of the Cliff, and I was expecting to let him out there, but the gate man saw that I had the Granada sticker in my windshield and assumed I was there on business, or else he was just doing it as a favor. He waved me right into the parking lot. And so I pulled up and I parked on the end of a line of cars. Next to me was a Mercedes, then a Range Rover, and so on. And I put my Vauxhall Astra at the end of the and the girls got out and ran off to watch the training, and I hung out in the car park with these two old geezers, because there's always two old geezers.
Yeah. Football club.
And after about 10 minutes, this gaggle of apprentices, youth players, came running out with buckets and sponges, and they washed the first team cars, because that's how it was still back then. You did not get these academy products that are making a fortune already. Yeah. These were apprentices. They cleaned the boots. They did all that stuff. And so these kids were scrubbing this line of cars, and I saw them get to my Vauxhall Astra, and it was like, really? But out of an excessive caution, I guess, they washed it. They thought it better. And so there was this skinny kid scrubbing one of the wheels, and one of these old geezers said to the other, which one's that? And he said, I think he's called David Beckham. He's from London. He's going to be quite good.
Brilliant. That's
very good. Well, the very final thing we always do is a super quick fire either or, and there's no right answer really here, apart from perhaps one of them. But we'll start off with UK or US crime, Andrew.
Well, as in crime fiction?
Yes. Sorry, as opposed to actual murders.
Crime figures.
Robberies.
Oh, I mean, they're both brilliant. I'm going to go with US.
Okay. Lee?
Instinctively, I'd want to go with the US, but I'd say the perfect thing would be a blend.
Okay.
The geography, the expanse, the horizons of the US with the technical, psychological aspects that you get from the UK.
Yeah. Okay.
TV or cinema, Lee?
TV. It's you don't have to sit next to smelly people texting on their phone. Well, it depends on your family, I guess, but in theory, it's a lot better.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with cinema, because there's a sense of occasion. I haven't been to the cinema in so long, but when you do go, it's a big deal. You get to go, you get the lovely snacks, you get the spectacle of it, the huge screen, the incredible sound. So it's much more of a special occasion, rather than TV can sometimes be more kind of background noise.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. Night owl or early bird, Andrew?
No question about that. Night owl, 100%.
Yeah, I've never understood the early bird. What does that even mean? I can remember in TV when they were talking about breakfast TV, and I used to think, well, we've already got the 5 o'clock news in the afternoon.
I remember, I forget which book it was. I wrote that, 'cause somebody had been criticizing me for not getting up early enough and, staying up too late. So I had a scene in the book where, one character says to the other, but the early bird gets the worm. And he's saying, yeah, but worms are gross. Why would you want a worm?
Music or no music when you're writing, Lee?
No music, because I think there's a lot of comparisons between writing and music. They start somewhere, they finish somewhere else, they proceed at a certain pace and rhythm. And I do not want that imposed on me by something else, certainly not with lyrics. So, yeah, I don't have any music playing when I'm writing.
No. I'm the same. My problem is there's something weird about the wiring in my head. If I hear a word, I tend to then write that word down, and I don't know if you ever get that, like if you're signing a book for somebody and you're talking to them, I can't talk to, I always worry that I'm appearing rude because I cannot talk to them while signing, because I will literally write whatever it is they just said to me.
So I've got a good story. I've got a good story there that I'm going to quickly give you, which is about Bobby Robson, the ex-England manager. Which is someone went up to get their book signed by him, and as he was signing, the guy that was getting the book signed said, "Oh, you must have been doing loads of these, Bobby." And he said, "Oh, millions, lad. Yeah, there you go." Gave him the book, and when he got home, it said "To Bobby Millions." So it was, yeah. And Tariq, the last one.
Very, very last one. Paper book or ebook?
Oh, paper book.
Paper book.
100% of the time. I was open-minded about ebooks, and I tried them, but it just doesn't do it for me at all.
Fair enough. Andrew, what's your thoughts?
Absolutely the same. Even to the point, I don't know if you guys find this, but even if I'm trying to edit my own work, I'll read it on the screen and think, oh yeah, that's fine. And then I'll print it on paper.
No, you spot the mistake, yeah.
There's something about the experience of reading. You don't engage with the words the same way if they're on screen. So yeah, paper every time.
Well, thanks very much to Lee and Andrew for talking to us today. It was amazing being able to speak to someone of that caliber. That truly a worldwide phenomenon, really. And I thought it was really interesting what he was saying about Reacher. He doesn't seem too sad to leave him behind in a way.
No. Interesting points about wanting to give. What did you say about IP? Whenever you create an IP, like
he wanted to give it to the readers ultimately.
Yeah.
It becomes theirs after a while, I guess.
Yeah,
so.
I suppose when you create something like that, it becomes bigger than you, doesn't it? It becomes this. I mean, Reacher is bigger than one. It's a phenomenon. So I suppose maybe it's easier to step away from something when it's that big, as opposed to a little personal thing. I don't know, but
and yeah. I mean, Andrew didn't say he felt under pressure now, but it must be a bit of pressure to carry that character on, obviously. But they've obviously been doing this sort of transition period, which I think was a good idea as well, to carry on from Lee to Andrew. So yeah, obviously I think Reacher's going to continue on and on and on. So you can pick up the latest Reacher book, In Too Deep, which is, as we've discussed, Andrew's first solo effort, really.
Yeah, that's right.
And Lee's book of short stories as well is out now. But it sounds like he's just looking forward to retirement, so that's fair enough.
He's definitely earned it, to be fair. 24 books. Create this massive universe. I think he's earned it.
Absolutely, yeah. And I thought, just before we move on, that idea of when he was coming up with the character to come up with a list of things that he didn't want him to be. He looked at Michael Connelly and Bosch, and he was like, "That's successful, so I'll make Reacher the opposite in many ways of this character."
I mean, it almost feels like the antithesis of creating a story or a plot. It's like, well, what, rather than going down the where do I want to take this character, what do I want to do with them, what the possibilities are endless. It's almost like no. Let's cut off the stuff we don't want, and what we're left with, that's a story, or that's a character. And it's something I've never thought about doing that before, that kind of backwards.
Yeah, but I
almost,
suppose
but it seemed to work.
in either creation thing, I suppose the important thing was that he was honing a space for that
Yeah.
character to grow and the type of story he wanted to tell. So
And I suppose you're always thinking about not wanting to do what other people have done and not wanting
Yeah.
and trying to find something original and unique. And I suppose that's probably the simplest way of doing it, isn't it? Just like what's been done, don't do that. That
yeah,
makes sense.
absolutely. So yeah, thanks very much to both of them for coming on to the podcast for episode 200. But episode 201 is coming up, and we have another
With-
great guest.
This man right here, David Goodman, A Reluctant Spy, is his debut novel, and we chat with him about.
He's got a few
what
to
it's like.
catch up with, Lee.
Yeah, it's got. Yeah, that's right.
Another
Although he does
23
also
years
have
in.
a number of short stories to
He
his
is
name
very
already.
successful
So he's
short story writer. Yeah.
successful short stories, debut spy novel. We talk about what it's like being a debut author. His path, again, someone who kind of on the surface might be seen as a great success, overnight success, but his journey to get to this book has been convoluted. He's had a couple of false starts, like pretty much every author has. So
Yep.
it's a really, really good chat about a new and exciting author.
Yeah, no, it's really good. And, regular listeners will have seen Dave on our Christmas special, of course, when we were sort of
That's
doing a
right.
review of the year. So, yeah, this is a full focus on his writing journey, and it is a really interesting one. He's a guy that is, very focused, very determined, and very has a good routine in his writing and stuff. So we talk all about that as well. So please do tune in for that one. If you enjoyed today's episode, as ever, please do take the time to rate and review us on your favourite podcast app or on YouTube. Leave a comment down below if you're watching on YouTube. Tell us how much you enjoyed it. That's always great, and it helps us to continue to get great guests on the podcast. We also, I know I mentioned it at the start, but we're just going to mention it again because we have the new Patreon. The link is in the podcast description. Please do go and check that out because there's a lot of different tiers and rewards that you can get if you want to support the pod. And the idea is that it'll allow us to continue to grow, maybe do more video episodes, do different types of episodes, really dive deep into chats with industry experts like agents and editors and things like that. So
We've got a lot of great ideas that we want to do, and different types of episodes, different guests, and some of them require some cash.
Yeah, well,
So
I mean,
it's all going to get funneled back.
We've done 200 episodes, and it has been absolutely a labour of love, and we still love doing it, and we don't want to change it. The regular podcast will always be available for free, but we want to try and expand our offering and make it better for everyone. So that's kind of the idea behind it. As part of one of the tiers, Tariq, you get a shout out if you sign up.
Shout out! I mean, that's worth £10.
We only launched it last week, but we have 2 people to shout out, except one of them,
Fantastic.
who we know, said they don't want a shout out. But I'm going to say a shout out to Jay. That's not giving the full name away. And also, I've got the name, the full list here of the membership. Hang on. Is Gordon McLachlan as well has signed up. So thank you very much, Gordon, for signing up. And you will be getting your first month benefits sent out to you very soon.
Which are a lovely bookmark.
A bookmark and a special page 1 pin.
Nice.
So
on month 1. And then, of course, on month 4, he then gets a novel from one of our guests, our past guests.
Indeed.
So, yes, that's
There's lots of benefits. So, as we said, please do take a look at the Patreon. But if people want to get in touch with us, Tariq?
If they want to get in touch, they can do so a number of ways. They can go onto any social media platform of choice, and they can search for at UK Page 1, or they can drop us an email by writing to podcast@rightgear.co.uk.
Yeah. And if you want as well, as we said, as part of the launch of the Patreon, we've also launched a Discord as well. Now, it's quite a quiet Discord at the moment, but the idea is that we want to grow it into being a proper community where people can talk about writing, can talk about episodes, can give guest suggestions, guest questions.
Questions for guests is quite exciting. Anything there they can chuck in.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just talk about, films you've seen, books you've read, all that sort of stuff. So we want to build that up. You can do that on the Patreon page. All you need to do is join for free. If you just want to be involved in the Discord, don't want any of the other benefits, you can just join for free. We'll send you a link so you can join up to that as well. So many ways to get in touch with us, so please do that.
Yep.
Thank you for joining us for this very special episode, and we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.
Thank you so much for listening to today's conversation with Nadine Matheson. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday for a brand new episode featuring more amazing guests. Don't forget to like, subscribe and leave a review. It really helps the podcast grow. And if you'd like to support the show, you can buy me a cup of coffee or sign up on Patreon. The links are in the show notes. And if you'd love to join the conversation as a guest, feel free to send an email to theconversation@nadinematheson.com. Thanks again for your support, and I'll catch you next time.